My name is Vivien, and this is my house. Now, it's critical that you believe from the outset that this is my house. Otherwise, none of this is going to work. It is not a historical society. It is not a stage set. It is my house, and I live here. Why would I live in a place like this? Well, I suppose the less than nice way is to put it that I am eccentric. 200 years ago, I would have been called an original, and I kind of rather like that terminology ever so much better. So I'm an original, and this is my house. Second thing you absolutely have to accept from the beginning, and I'm going to paraphrase the beginning of Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Marley was dead. You need to believe that Marley was as dead as a doornail, or nothing that comes afterward is going to work for you at all. My house is haunted. So I'm hoping that you're going to believe, A, I live here, and B, that it is haunted. And the whole premise of getting together here and having myself filmed by some very good friends of mine is to eventually tell you a ghost story or read you a ghost story in a haunted house that actually is the home of the person reading and or telling the story. This makes this whole experience unique. Because we aren't ghost hunters. Well, we're going to hunt for ghosts here, and we have hunted ghosts. And there are ghosts here, and we're finally going to hunt for those. Okay. This is my house. Now, the story of my house is very important because you're going to want to know who's haunting it and necessarily maybe why. I'm not sure anymore. I have lived in this house for 49 years. I bought it in 1973, and it was not old enough for my taste. It was built in 1903. I wanted a house that was built in like 1863, but I could not have one, so I got this one. And sadly, it is now 119 years old, and I'm old too. And that didn't work, but that's what happened. So I live in an old house, and I didn't know it was haunted. Now, had I known it was haunted, I might have been less not happy with it at the time. And I'll tell you my first experience with the ghost. So the first thing that happened to me in my haunted house was, well, I have to back up. The house was not a pretty place to look at. I bought it only because my first husband, who was a sociopath, and we won't talk too much about him, he didn't want to live like 60 miles from where he worked, so we had to move over here, and I wasn't happy when we bought it, and I didn't like it, and it was shabby, and it wasn't clean, and it had Minutemen wallpaper in my dining room, and it just was not a nice place at all. And so we were cleaning up the mess and trying to make it look halfway habitable. And every time I would come here in the mornings, because we weren't living here, I would be miserable. And I decided I needed a place in this house that I felt was peaceful, that looked halfway decent, that might even look like it was an old house. Well, I had antiques even then. So there's this little room, and it's kind of upstairs, and it's kind of over the dining room, and it overlooks a bay window. It's not very big. And it has two pretty long windows, and there was a bed in there. And it's a little old iron bed. Now, I did not know at the time that that bed has been in this house since at least 1911. And you're going to see in a little bit. So that was there. So I moved in my dresser, which is a pretty old dresser. It's still up there. And I had a rubber tree. Everybody in 1973 had a rubber tree. So I had this little rubber tree, and I had some little lacy doilies, and everything was real pretty. And I had little lacy curtains, and I had an old hired man's quilt, which was these old ties all sewn together with feathered stitches. And I made it all nice and pretty. And I would go up there in the afternoon while the sociopath was still working, and I would take a nap. But I always cleaned the house up real nice, the little room, not the house, oh no, the little room, always real nice, to straighten up the little bed and everything before I went home, so that when I came back in the morning to the debris and the disaster that was this house I bought, I had a place I could go and feel relatively calm. So on this occasion, we go home, we come back, I come in, I go up to my little room, and I find the impression of a head in the pillow on the bed. Now, there was no one else here. There was no one else could have got in, at least that I know of. And there were no animals here at the time. I had not moved mine in yet. And the previous owner's cat had been taken away with them. It was an impression of a head in that pillow. I swear to God it was. So I straightened it all up, and it didn't happen again. Then a couple of days later, the sociopath was up on a ladder, and he swore that he heard my voice, or a woman's voice, right in his ear calling him. And he turned around, and he said, yes. And of course I wasn't there, and he calls out to me, and I come in, and he tells me that this is what he heard. And I said, well, I'm in the other room. I'm not here. I don't know what you heard. This made us somewhat suspicious, but we didn't think too much about it, and then time kind of got away from everybody, and he left me the very next year for a flat-chested woman, which I am not, and he was gone. At that point, then, all I really did was trying to concentrate on paying the taxes on Tara and keeping my house. So it was a lot of time later. Then one time I went out of town and I asked a neighbor if she would come and watch my animals for me, and she did. And I do not know what possessed her to come at night, but for some reason she thought that was a fitting time to come, and she come at like 9 o'clock at night, and she's trying to feed the animals, and she hears footsteps upstairs. Now, the average person, you and I, we would automatically assume it was a ghost, right? No, she's convinced that it's some kind of home invasion. Least likely possibility. So she goes home and she gets her husband, and they come back, and she sends him upstairs, and he goes in every cupboard and closet there can be upstairs looking for these home invaders, and of course does not find them. At which point, I think they're finally creeped out by the whole situation, and they go home. She did subsequently take care of my animals, but she never came after dark again. Well, then, the times just sort of changed again, and there were a couple more sociopaths that I actually made the mistake of marrying. Well, the one in the middle was just a drunk, but the last one, he was the worst of the sociopaths. But anyway, then I'm all alone again. And in the meantime, when I was alone, I got to feeling I did not really like sleeping upstairs. My bedroom was across the hall from the little bedroom over the bay window. And it would kind of make me uncomfortable when my door was open all night long, that there was another room across the hall that I didn't like, where there had once been what? The impression of a head in the pillow. So I was very uncomfortable, but I'd have to get up in the night, and I'd have to go down, and I'd have to pee, and I'd have to not think about it. And time progressed until I had to get up more often to go to the bathroom, to go down to pee, and I got more uncomfortable. And I finally decided I'm going to move downstairs. So I did. I moved downstairs. I thought that was going to solve the problem altogether. And I moved out a whole pretty new bedroom set, no, old, new to me, antique bedroom set, which included a real old dresser. Beautiful marble top dresser from a much earlier time than this house. And I moved it all down into a downstairs bedroom that I have, where I had known that the people that lived here before had slept. And I did know that the woman of that family had died in that room. She had come home after church one Sunday morning, and she lay down in her bed, and she never got up again alive. So I didn't even think anything about that, and I moved into the room, and everything was fine. And then one night, I woke up, and I was surrounded by dogs. I always sleep with dogs. They were utterly worthless to what was about to happen. And coming from the dresser on the one wall and floating across the room and across the footboard of the bed I'm sleeping in is the figure of a woman. Now, the woman was not of this house. It was of the period of the dresser. Now, I know a little bit about ghosts, and I knew that this was what they call an echo ghost. It wasn't a real ghost, just something that happened to be associated with the dresser. And I'm this great psychic, potentially mediumistic ghost woman, and I sold that dresser so fast would make your head spin. But I figured that what had happened was, it was fine upstairs, but as soon as I moved it downstairs into that room where that woman had died, then I had seen that echo. So it wasn't really the ghost of the house. And over time, I got to thinking, what was it that I was feeling, and why was I uncomfortable? And I knew from a woman that I had met through a gentleman who had lived here in this neighborhood for all this life, that her family had lived in this house, and she told me some things. She told me about a daughter who was her cousin, a daughter by the name of Gertrude. And Gertrude, it was said, had been dragged into the West by her husband and went off to North Dakota. No, I guess it was South Dakota. Can't keep those Dakotas straight. And she went to South Dakota, and she died having had a child. So somehow or other in my head, after all those years, I got it into the impression that she was guarding this little room upstairs where her little baby had been brought back to live. So I always associated the little room with Gertrude and the ghost. Now, the child was not the ghost. The child lived was just fine, but Gertrude was guarding her baby in that room. As time went on, I don't know that I believed that wholeheartedly enough. I wrote a ghost story about it once, and I had it published in the Old House Journal. I embellished the truth dreadfully, but it got published. And I told everybody about the ghost that's Gertrude. Well, before I go on, so that you have some kind of reference points, we're going to go now. We're going to move. We're going to get up. We're going to go in the other room, and I'm going to show you what she looked like. These these are the people that lived here. Now the cool thing is about how I got these pictures is that one day I was having a porch sale at my house that I had every year, and two women come up on the porch and they introduced themselves and they said that their great-grandfather had lived here. And the one was a psychic. And I said, well, come on in. I just abandoned the porch sale and I let her come in, and she grabs her throat in her bosom and she says, kin, be calling to kin. Well, she was a psychic and kin was calling to kin. After that, she told me all kinds of stuff about the family, most of which I don't think was true, but she claimed she'd gotten it from the psychic plane, and we'd become the bosomest of friends, and she gave me pictures of her great-grandfather and her great-grandmother and Gertrude. So I asked her, where do you think they would like to have themselves displayed? And she said, somewhere prominently where people can see them. So it's right here, not far from my front door, and I show these pictures to everybody that come out of respect for them. And you can see, this is little Miss Mary, and she's standing there on my porch steps. And Miss Gertrude, every time there's a picture of Miss Gertrude taken, she's like looking off into the distance, kind of sadly like. And there's Frank Ash, and he's just as stolid a man as ever you'd want to see. He was born in Poland, first-generation immigrant, very proud of it, of the fact he could have a house like this. And he worked for the railroad, and we'll talk about him on another occasion. But anyway, he worked for the railroad, and he had a pretty good position, and he was well respected in the town. And he had more than one child. Gertrude was his eldest, and that's their pictures. And now I'm going to sit down in a different chair altogether, and I'm going to tell you about her brother Bernard and the tragedy that happened to poor Bernard. So like I said, these two women come to my house, and it turns out, of course, that their family had lived here, and they were lovely women, and they had mentioned the first thing right off that it hadn't been long, this was in 2016, since they had been to a commemorative memorial service out in Amherst, because one of their uncles, I guess, must have been uncles, great-great-great-uncles, who was born here, one of the children here, had been killed in this dreadful train wreck, real well known, happened out in Amherst. And his name was Bernard. Now the family had Miss Gertrude, the eldest, and then Bernard, and then there was a child born whose name was Leon, a boy. No, take it back, he was the baby. No, there was another girl. And she was, no, take it back, I'm getting all these babies. Doesn't matter, never mind. This is what happens when you're trying to remember stuff about other people's families. In any event, there were a bunch of children. And Bernard was the second to the oldest. Now, as I said, Frank was a railroad man. Actually, the house was built in 1903. Frank didn't move here till 1911. It was built in 1903 by another railroad man, and this being because of the fact it's right by the railroad. And so, anyway, Bernard went to work for the railroad. Now, I have tried to redo Miss Susan's research to see if all of this can be confirmed, that what he was actually doing on the train that early morning was that he says he was a clerk of some kind. And there were mail clerks on these trains because the railroads, they had their own postal system, and they had to go from depot to depot and pick up the mail. So that may have been why he was there. But in the early morning hours of March the 29th, around 3:15 in the morning, the engineer, the first half of number 86, thought he saw a danger signal. And so he stops his train on the tracks. And he gets off the train to check out on the danger signal. And while he's looking at it, it just sort of stops being a danger signal altogether, from which he assumes it was an incorrect danger signal. So he tries to get on his train and start it up again. But the wheels just spin on the tracks because it doesn't want to start from a dead stop. Meanwhile, the other section of number 86, which is coming down the track, is an altogether larger train, and it's coming, but it's still part of the same train, but it's coming. And it can't see in the fog. And so it rams directly in to the first part of number 86. Now back then, the rear cars were not necessarily freight cars. They weren't freight cars. These were passenger trains and stopped all along the line at the various depots. So it had a sleeping car, and it had a buffet car, and some of these were wooden cars. And indeed, when second part of 86 slams into first part of 86, it just trashes those cars at the rear. And it knocks a bunch of the cars of first number 86 off onto the tracks on the other side. And in no time at all, coming from the east, And heading to the West Coast, coming from New York and heading out to the West Coast, comes the 21st New York Central at a clip. And it smashes into those cars on the side. And the whole thing is just one huge pile of torn up metal and burning wood and steam and screams and horrors. And it was one of the worst train wrecks ever, if not the worst up until that time in this state. People were just thrown everywhere. They were scalded, they were scorched, they lost limbs, they lost part of themselves, their heads. One man lost his scalp, and some god-awful man who come into the wreckage with a whole bunch of other scavengers actually stole the scalp from the wreckage. Horror story. 29 people died in that morning, in that rubble, in various twisted forms. They could not identify the bodies. One man, teenage son, identified it by a signet ring on a finger that they found. Horrible. Anyway, Bernard Ashe was working on that train, probably just a mail clerk, probably taking the mail from one depot to another depot, and he was one of those that died. The worst and saddest part of it was that he didn't die on sight. 27 of them died on sight, and the others died the next morning too, and he was one of those. So I do not like to think of the condition of Bernard. But anyway, when those trains collided, the people sleeping in their beds in Amherst could hear that crash and the screams of the metal and the screams of the dead people for miles around. Like I said, thousands of people came to the wreckage, and some were there to help. Most were there to help, except a lot of bad people who were there to see what was in the pockets of the dead or thrown around in their suitcases. A horrible story. One really cool part of the whole story was that on the New York Central, heading west to the West Coast, was the most famous actress of her day, of all the silver screen silent movie stars, and it was Miss Mary Pickford. And she was on that train. And she got off with another actress who had been her understudy from wherever place she was doing out in New York. And she got out of that train and she got down into that wreckage and she helped as many people as she possibly could. And even when they had enough clearance so that a car could get past and get out of there, a train car, she wouldn't leave. She wouldn't leave until every single person that was injured could be helped, was out of that wreckage. So if you remember Miss Mary Pickford, and I bet you most don't even know who she is, that's really a big deal. Well, anyway, Bernard's body was brought back, and it was buried here, not far from this house, and it was buried in a cemetery, which I drive by every day, and his parents eventually joined him in death, and eventually were buried next to him or in the same plot, and there's a beautiful headstone, which you're going to see a picture of. And poor Miss Gertrude, she didn't die until 1922, 6 years later, and she's also buried in that plot. Well, like I said, I really thought that my ghost was Gertrude because of this tragedy of her going out there to North Dakota and dying with a baby that at the time was only a month and a half, and her dying suddenly after giving birth, not right during birth, but after giving birth, and then having to come back here in a train and what have you and get buried down the road. I thought for sure it was her, and that maybe she was upset that she hadn't gotten to raise that child, that maybe she was concerned that something could happen to it, so I always got the feeling that she had to see that. Other things happened that I forgot to talk about because I don't like to think about them because they involve me getting old. I've had to have a couple of replacement surgeries like old people have of their joints, and it was nothing important and it was nothing dire, and I didn't think there was any chance of my dying. But maybe Susan, the psychic woman, was right. The ghosts in this house like me. because of what I've done here. I haven't changed much of anything. And what was changed, I put back to the way it used to be. And they say they like the way I take care of the house. Well, apparently they don't mind dust. They like the way I take care of the house. And all that's really very nice. So anyway, I didn't think that when things started to happen, because I'd had these little surgeries, that anything was correlating to my health, that maybe they were worried something was going to happen to me, and maybe they knew more than I did. But anyway, I had my knee done at 20 and 18, and I'm in my bed, and I'm in pain, and I'm trying to rest, and I hear a clicking here in the dining room of the front door, the lock on the front door. And I figure, well, some people have keys, including these people filming me now, and I trust them, and it's them, and I call out, hello, Joe, hello, are you here? Nothing. And my little dog hears it, and he comes running in to look to see if it's Joe. No, it's not. It's just not. So I go back, and I go back to rest, and then a couple of nights later, the same thing happens. And I come in, and I'm all out of breath, and I just forget about it. The third time, the front door was actually partially open. And this isn't good, because I have a cat that could just let herself right out if she thought about it. At that point, I say, Gertrude, thinking again that it was Gertrude, though it didn't seem to be like a poor grieving mother for her dead baby to be playing pranks. I said, Gertrude, can you hear how out of breath I am? Don't be doing this to me anymore. And it stopped. And that got me to thinking afterwards, well, that's the kind of prank that a young boy would pull. And of course, I forgot to mention that poor Bernard, when he died in that horrific wreck, was only 22 years of age. And that's the kind of thing he might have done. So I figured, okay, he was pulling a prank. Then now Susan swore that Bernard came and went, that he hadn't a residence here as a ghost. He just occasionally came and went. Until, now this is the part I'm going to tell you that's really, really scary. So if you just don't want to handle the scary, you can just move on. Anyway, I'm in my bedroom. And this is a couple months ago, and I hear this horrific noise. It just really sounds like there's something going wrong with a major engine of an appliance, and I'm assuming that it's the motor. Yes, it's the motor, not the engine. Something's going really wrong with a motor. That's what I thought I heard. And so I get up, and I come in, and I look down the register. The first thing all a woman does is go look down the register on the floor to see if her furnace is blown up. But no, the furnace is going on because it's air conditioning time, and there's just this little humming, and there's nothing. So I even go back and open the window over where the air conditioner is, thinking it's the No, the air conditioner is just fine. But it was a loud, screechy sound, and I was still real worried. And of course, all my friends said, oh no, it's this appliance, it's that appliance, it was this, it was that. No, it was not, but I thought, well, all right, it isn't happening anymore. 2 months later, this time the sound starts out like the screech and wail of a banshee. I can't even describe it. It was so loud, it was like a scream that you hear in a movie, but it wasn't quite human, but it was loud and it was high and it was screechy. And then it goes and it changes. At this point, it sounds like someone threw my cat in the flywheel of a very large motor. Just a yowly, screechy sound. And then moves on until it sounds like someone took a wrench and throws that right in a running car engine, and there's more shrieking and more metal tearing, and then it stops. By this time, Rags, my dog, is totally, he can't hear from where it's going, but he can even figure out the direction it's going from because he's old. The cat hears it. The other cat that's come down to eat, who's scared of everything, he still wants to eat, but he's slinking along the floor like cats do when they're scared. So all three of them heard it too. It wasn't just me. So I look out the window, which is a natural thing to do, and there's nothing going on in the street, and my furnace motor's fine, and my air conditioner is just rumbling away. Now, being somewhat dense or in denial, it took me a while to figure out what I think I probably heard, but you probably know what I think I probably heard. I've never heard it before. I don't really want to hear it now. I don't want to hear it again ever. It was awful. Well, we're upstairs, and this is my little room, the room I told you about, and this is the little bed that I'm really sure has been here probably since the Ashes moved into this house in 1911. Now you have to see, look at this. This is even the original old little mattress with the blue and white strap ticking that everybody's mattresses had then. And if you look under here, don't look at dust, this is the old mechanism for the springs, everything just as it was, and I found it here when I moved in 1973, and I'm certain it was here in 1945 when poor Mr. Ash sold the house to the people I bought the house from. So that's the little bed, and this is the pillow. This is the pillow where I found that impression of a head. Won't do it now, because it really had to be in there for a while, I guess, for it to make an impression. And it wasn't the impression of a child. It was the impression of, I think, a man's head. And this is bringing to me what I've been thinking. For all the years I've lived here, 49, it'll be 49 in October, I really did think that the ghost was just Miss Gertrude, because it's just a sad story of her poor thing, you know, dying when she was in 1922. She hadn't been married long. She was actually almost 30, with 2 little babies. She had a little girl, at that time would have been 2, and then of course the baby, Charles Francis Stager, he was only 1 month and 24 days old when she died suddenly there in South Dakota in January of 1922. Well, as would happen at that time, and it was awful sad all the time, the father couldn't take care of children like that, and so he was going to bring them back to their grandparents, Frank and Mary. And of course he was going to take a train. Everything was done by train, and poor Gertrude, she was dead in the baggage car ahead. And that's a great introduction for a little song that you're going to hear in the background that was just about like things like that, where a father had a baby and the baby was fussing, and all the people around said, "Where is that baby's mother? To quiet that child, it's fussing and disturbing us." And the poor bereaved father said, "She's riding in the baggage car ahead." So I love that song, and it's very appropriate.
The innocent one began crying, as though its poor heart would break. Make that child stop its noise, one angry man said, for it's keeping all of us away. Put it out, said another, don't keep it in here. We've paid for our birth and want rest. Never a word said the man with the child as he fondled it close to his breast. Where is its mother? Go take it to her. A maiden then softly said, I wish that I could, was the man's sad reply, but she's dead in the coach ahead.
But anyway, so poor Gertrude, she come home and she's buried down the road, and John Stager, he went and left, and he married another woman he found here in Cleveland, took her this time to Nebraska, and he never came back for the children. So there was poor little John Francis and poor little Mary, and they were raised here. And I got to thinking, all of the people that lived here. There was Gertrude, and Bernard, and Leon, and Helen, as she was called, even though her name was Caroline, don't ask me why. And then maybe a cousin that I heard lived here. And then poor little baby John, and poor little baby Mary. So where did they all sleep, and whose room was this really? I don't know. Could it have been the child's and the baby's room like I thought it was? Well, it surely wasn't when he was just, less than 2 months old. And of course, Bernard, he'd been dead now for 6 years before those babies came. And this bed doesn't look like a baby's bed. This bed looks like a boy's bed. And I just have a funny feeling that after all these years of fixing this room up to be little Gertrude's room, that she was guarding her little baby, and that's why I didn't like even sleeping across the room from it. Maybe that isn't the case. Maybe it was Bernard said that was there. And maybe it's Bernard, because he died so tragic-like, that's been responsible for a lot of this stuff. And it all started getting worse in 2018 when I had my surgery. And now I'm kind of wondering if maybe they're all getting upset because I'm getting old. And what's going to become of the house, and what's going to become of them when I'm gone. Well, anyway, this room has always been the worst room in the house, the one I've been the most afraid of, and it's over top of the dining room, and you can see down the floor to the dining room from the old cold air return. So a lot of the things that happen in the dining room, is it a coincidence they're right below this room? I don't know. But all I know is I was real glad when I moved downstairs to the bedroom that Frank and Mary shared, even though Mary died in bed in that room. I felt more comfortable in that room than I did walking past this room in the middle of the night. But I've always known it was haunted, so now I'm going to tell you one last thing. Now, I think I've made it real clear I'm eccentric. And I think I may have made it clear that I'm not a bit maternal, because you don't see any children in this house. I had a stepson, the poor boy. I had a stepson with the third sociopath, and he was like this boy. He was an okay boy, but he wasn't, I wasn't used to children, and I didn't know where else to put him, except in this room. Even though, like I said, the Ashes found room for 5 people, I only found 1 room for that poor boy. So he's up here and he's taking a nap, and I'm downstairs doing what I'm doing, and pretty soon down comes Jason, and he says to his father, he says, "Dad, there's papers floating around in my room." Well, his father was bone lazy. He wasn't about to go upstairs and looking around for flying paper. And myself, well, if there was flying paper, I wasn't going to be able to do anything about it. And there wasn't anywhere else I was going to put that child. So I said, go on back, you'll be fine, Jason, just don't even think about it. And to this day, I kind of wonder if I didn't traumatize that boy, but such is what it was. Well, I'm going now, and you're going to see me again, and I'm going to tell you a ghost story next time. Well, actually, I'm going to read you a ghost story, and on other occasions, I may tell you one. But look forward to the next one, because it's a wonderful story, and it's about a little ghost. And I'll see you then, and I'm awful glad you came.